Hello, my name is Dr. Catherine Hewlett, and I'm very pleased to be here at your ADSHE conference. And I'm going to give a talk about celebrating the neurodivergent researcher, and it's going to be in 3 sections. So if you just give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen with you for that presentation. Okay, I hope you can all see that presentation now. And as I said, we're talking about celebrating the neurodivergent researcher. And this is very much in celebration of your organisation, because I believe this is a 20-year celebration for you all. So off we go. So as I said, it's going to be in 3 sections. It's about approaches to research for the neurodivergent researcher. And I'm mainly going to be talking about doctoral research, actually, and the gap in knowledge. I'm going to be using my own research as a case study, which spanned several years, and mixed method and multidisciplinary. And the name of that, the title of that research was Sociocultural Investigation of Visual Dyslexic Cognition. And finally, I'm going to be talking about the Achievability e-journal as a platform for the neurodivergent researcher voice. Hopefully, it'll take about 30 to 40 minutes. So what's been happening recently? A lot in terms of neurodivergent people and research. In fact, it's become more open and flexible for people doing this level of research. People in universities are accepting much more the multidisciplinary approach and the mixed methods approach. And that is shown actually by networks being developed across universities, such as the Staff Disability Network in ADSHE. And in particular, I want to give a special mention to Dr. Rajita Deetal, I hope I've said your name correctly, who is one of the people who helps to coordinate the neurodiversity JISC mail. And that just shows you what has been happening in terms of support of others in the research field who are neurodivergent. I want to mention DSA, Disability Student Allowance, because it's a fantastic support mechanism for people in higher education. However, I hope I'm not going to be contentious here, but I want to say at doctoral level, there is less support. I know that myself. And it's just because support workers, the non-medical health workers, tend not to have been trained up to doctoral level. And people do need to understand the length of time this takes in terms of doctoral research and the amount of writing that has to happen. And I'm going to be talking about that next as particular challenges for doctoral students who are neurodivergent. So yes, signposting is incredibly important, especially as most doctorates end up being quite linear. And that's because of the way they are managed within higher education and what supervisors tend to require. I'm tending to talk about humanities doctorates. That's where my dissertation lay, my thesis was rooted. And signposting is so important because it enables people to keep to the argument and the debate, because we know our neurodivergent minds are often going off tangent and mapping lots of reference points all the time to make sense of where we're placed, what we're investigating, and sense of the topic that we are researching. Many people with dyslexia particularly struggle with the reading or writing, but have become extremely skilled in it often because they've overcome many challenges, but are particularly skilled at deciphering facts, from patterns or events. So some of the analytical methods that you can use within research are very useful for this type of thinking, such as interpretive analysis, where you're having to interpret patterns and events to make sense of it with a coding system. And this is what I did. So yes, doctoral research is still often very linear. And it's the literature review that really does fool people, because it is usually required in text. And it is a very important part of doctoral research, because the whole point about it is you are saying, well, there is a reason for me to do this research because I've looked at the literature and it has shown a gap in research. So getting lost is very often what happens when we're doing this type of work as a neurodivergent researcher. We get lost, and we need to have the signposting. We need to keep focused with the main debate or argument. We need to be linking our thinking with everything else within the research, such as research methods and the perspective, the research perspective you are coming from, and how you organize data and information to make it meaningful for you. Structure is so important to be able to return to from your mapping exercise, all those reference points that you are mapping in order to make sense of the investigation. And most importantly, it's about managing your supervisors. I was lucky, I had a couple of neurodivergent supervisors, so they understood when I was talking about my approaches to research, they understood what I was on about. But often doctorate students have to manage their supervisors because they can change. Throughout your time of study, your supervisors can change, particularly if you're doing part-time. So research methods, what is that? Many neurodivergent students get to postgraduate level knowing little about research methods that are helpful to their way of thinking. They might have had research methods at university at postgraduate level, for example, and undergraduate level. Most universities would offer that, but it would tend not to be inclusive of their way of thinking, or they would not have actually voiced their way of thinking during their studies. And it's important, as we all know, to have those strategies and tools to be able to collect the data and information and be able to process that information and analyse, to be able to reveal new information and to fill that gap in knowledge, which is what it's all about. The gap in research, that's the underpinning premise in doctoral work. I think it's equally valid not to find a gap, to do that literature review and not find a gap and say, well, actually, there isn't a gap in research, so I'm going to develop another form of inquiry. Very valid. So, as I've said, focus is really, really important for a neurodivergent doctoral researcher. The research question is key to be able to ground you. That research question can change. People don't realise this, but it can change. As you go through the process of investigation, you might find that your inquiry has changed, that actually there is a gap elsewhere, or there is less of a gap, or the context of your research has changed. Perfectly valid to change the research question, but very important to keep going back to it, to remind yourself of why you're doing this investigation, particularly if you go off tangent a lot. And it's very easy to do that because neurodivergent people love finding out about things. Important to keep that philosophical perspective that underpins your research, and to design your research methods with that perspective in mind, to accept a change in thought process, as I said. Most importantly, I think, for humanities anyway, is to include your position. Why are you doing this at all? Why do you find this of value? And once you include your position, of course, you need to include any bias that you might have. And I found that throughout my research, it was quite good to have a reflexive section throughout, where I was reflecting on whether I did have any bias or not, whether my own personal position was interfering with the research. And of course, ethics is so important, and of course you need to have ethics approval throughout. Again, your supervisors are so important to this process, because it's your supervisors who will get you through the bureaucracy of research, such as ethics. So I talked about structure earlier. Structure is deeply important. It's even more important to a neurodivergent researcher. And to have that structure in place can be changed, but to have that in place at the beginning is so important, such as the introduction, the context, why are we doing this? That will immediately link up to the findings later on, because that context is so important in which to position your findings. So completing the route map, and I've just talked about introduction and concluding points. And many neurodivergent researchers, again, go off tangent, and it's about signposting again. And they completely forget that what they set out to and said at the beginning, the context, the background, why is this happening, what is intended, to link that up, to signpost it to their concluding points, and also to signpost it to any further research that they think might be done in this area. Really important to say that. When people are doing literature reviews, they get utterly overwhelmed. And actually, it's quite simple if you have a few simple rules. I did not read everything. What I did was I would look for key tag words, look it up in the index, and then find the relevant pages. So I would signpost those pages for me to read in depth, because those pages were relevant to my topic and my subject area. Neurodivergent researchers think they have to read everything. And in fact, actually, neurotypical researchers know that you don't have to. And, you know, it's very interesting. People in top jobs in blue chip companies know they don't have to read everything. It's about finding the relevant area and section for you to be able to gather your data. When gathering that data, it's important to know how to organise the information, to keep your electronic folders clear and titled. And when making notes, you signpost those notes to the relevant sources and make sure that everything is short and clear in terms of sentences, and each paragraph is a topic. It's not rocket science, but people get lost in this, particularly when they're dealing with large amounts of text. So let's talk about my research now. As a case study, it took me a long time. We're going to talk about it in terms of what I have just said, some of the challenges and some of the ways to navigate those challenges. I put my proposal together, or started to put my proposal together in 2005. But it wasn't until 2010 that my proposal was accepted. And the reason for that was because I was deeply involved in many other things in my life, such as work and family. My research was part-time, and this can happen to you, particularly if you are researching a topic that's very personal to you. You do end up often having to study it part-time because of financial issues as well. It's much cheaper to study it part-time, and also you are having to juggle a lot with life and other areas of life. I particularly wanted this research to be 50% practice and 50% academic, because I was coming from a visual arts background. Although I've done lots of things in my career, my background is in the visual arts, and I had graduated from the Royal College of Art some time ago, many years ago actually. And I was particularly interested in how visual artists who are neurodivergent think to their practice, and if this is any different with neurotypical visual artists. I wanted to find that out. And of course, I wanted to include 50% practice of my neurodivergent visual artists. But as I went through my dissertation from 2010, this 50% got lessened. And it was because of the fact that the text-based linear more approach would be more understood by bureaucracy, by the systems, by any external examiner. And that's what happened. So the title of my research changed quite a lot throughout, but in the end, I came to the conclusion that this is what it was about: a socio-cultural investigation of visual dyslexic neurodivergent cognition. And I knew I had to put in socio-cultural in there, because that is the context in which this sits, this topic. Because visual artists who are neurodivergent, they are dealing with a lot of socio-contextual contexts in the development of their work and their thinking. And I had several chapters on this. And my field work did also consider these contexts too. So my research statement eventually came to this, which is: visual creative practice is produced through the skill of thinking within a dimensional context that is both divergent and multifaceted. And okay, that's from my viewpoint and my bias, you would say. But I felt, having talked to a number of people within the field work, that probably was the root of it, because visual artists, did work across a range of media, and they did work across a range of contexts, and increasingly so. I also said that the neurodivergent approach to visual creative thinking happens outside the mainstream, and that's the reason for the socio-cultural context. And I have a reason for saying that, because of talking and investigating so many visual neurodivergent artists who had conversations about how they had managed to keep their neurodivergent thinking and develop it quite apart from mainstream education. And I'm talking about secondary school education here. I'm not talking about art school, because this is where many artists in the end congregated, because that was appropriate to their way of thinking and learning. So my research questions, as I said, fundamental. What are the visual thinking approaches of neurodivergent artists? How does this approach impact on their practice? What is the socio-cultural value? And my aim was to examine these artists thinking in their approach to their practice. Absolute aim there. Underpinned everything I did. So this research approach was cross-disciplinary. That was another challenge, actually, because my research spanned across sociology, psychology, and education. Didn't sit comfortably with any department. And it was within an experiential and social construct. So it was within a constructivist construct of understanding that relationships were the root to all our learning, whether it's our inner environments or our outer environments. And the research approach was iterative, meaning going back and forth and exploring those inner and outer environments. It was phenomenological, looking at the first person viewpoint, and ethnographic, looking at the culture. And it was reflexive to ensure there was a lack of bias. So it was cross-disciplinary, absolutely. And I said I would try to have 50-50, but it didn't happen. And I said it was rooted within educational contexts, sociology and psychology, actually. I had a mixed method of data collection and a variety of tools within, in the main, qualitative research. And as I mentioned, it was in the particular social constructivist perspective, and the analysis was interpretive. Very quickly show you this slide. That was the structure of the research, and it kept me grounded. Interestingly, there are 4 chapters devoted to the fieldwork. I really enjoyed the fieldwork. I was learning by doing. I did not enjoy the literature review, but in fact, actually, I worked so hard on the literature review, it was one of the best chapters. I did not enjoy it. Okay, then, research fieldwork, those 4 chapters. The methodology, mixed method, triangulation approach. In the main, to test reliability and validity of the research, really important. I was testing the validity of the research first and foremost with case study exhibitions. I was allowed that. We had 4 exhibitions to ensure that it was valid, this research that I was exploring, and that there was an interesting thinking towards practice. I then had a survey of 40 artists, both neurotypical and neurodivergent, and interviews drawn from that survey, 14, 50-50, neurodivergent, neurotypical. The sampling of all those artists is what we call purposive, which means that I purposely targeted visual artists. This was not randomized. So, examples of tools. There are 3 exhibitions, and you can find the exhibitions on these Vimeo links. Fascinating. I was one of the artists. There were 4 of us. Very interesting. We did not actually consult each other much, but we just came in, did these exhibitions, and it was almost like osmosis, the way we interacted visually with each other, and how our work linked up, because we were very different in our practice in terms of the visual arts. One person was a painter, one person was a multimedia artist, one person was a performer, and I was a drawer, painter. So from those exhibitions, I realised it was important to carry on with this research. It was valid. So now I had to test the reliability of it. And so that's why the survey and the interviews happened. And as I said, the survey, I was looking at about 40 people there. It was 40 people. And from that, I had to try to interpret the information in order to then move on to the interviews, to inform the interviews, to inform the interviews with the questions drawn from the surveys. There were ways I interpreted the information. It was through word clouds, it was through keywords, and it was through clusters of references to reveal the thematic patterns. This is an example of my coding from a survey, and you can see I really got into it. In fact, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have got involved in age groups at all. I should have just got involved in groupings in terms of dyslexic or non-dyslexic visual artists. And you can see some of the questions there: ways of interpreting ideas, your strategies, views of creativity. Very interestingly, what came out of the surveys was that neurodivergent artists tended to work across a wider range of medium, a much wider range of medium than neurotypical artists. Apologies. And here we have coding for the actual interviews, and it's called Axel coding because it's about meaningful coding. And you can see I color coded in order to look at the weighting evidence, in particular looking at keywords in order for me to identify the weighting of evidence. Here we have some word clouds which help me. I would collect those weighting of words and I would put it into software to make sense visually for myself where some of the key emphasis lay. This is neurotypical, non-dyslexic visual artists. You can see there's an emphasis on reading, feedback, critical awareness, critique, much more kind of consistent and linear and logical. Another neurotypical word cloud, looking at reading again, looking at assessing, very much those very logical, linear ways of interpreting information. Here we have dyslexic visual artists. And what's so interesting about this group is that they didn't particularly like reading, but they did it because they've been trained to do that. But they loved writing. Writing had become really important. It was like a physical a way of describing their ideas, and words became important. So poetry became important. A lot of the artists have become almost obsessive about words and how the shapes of those words, the way they were sounded out, the aesthetics of those words. One artist had even tattooed bullet points on his hand so he could write the keywords each day next to the bullet pointed tattooed areas on his hand. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Another neurodivergent word cloud, as you can see, opinions. It's about images, it's about projects, about doing, about discussion. Different ways of interpreting meaningful information. What were my key findings? My key findings were that neurodivergent artists actually had an enhanced ability for thinking as flowed movement within a multidimensional framework. So when I talk about multidimensional, I'm talking about 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions. They had the ability to move around in their heads, their mind's eye, looking at a particular object. What was so really interesting about all of this is that when I asked the question of the dyslexic neurodivergent artists, when you remember this day, how would you do that? Can you do this in movement? All of them could reel back the moments in their day as a film. It was filmic thinking. It was inherent in their cognitive thinking. They didn't think this was of any value. It was so inherent. Yet when I asked the question of the neurotypical artists, they found that very difficult to do, to think in a filmic way and reel back those moments of the day in a filmic way. Consequently, many artists who are neurodivergent had done this outside of mainstream education. They had contained their way of thinking through their visual arts. They had nurtured it and kept it going. It was inherent in them. Consequently, they often had the outsider experience. Now, some of the key elements of this flowed thinking were reference points that we talked about earlier, mapping reference points, the flexibility to adapt, convergence of thinking, that filmic movement I've talked about within a multidimensional context. So it was inherent, it was iterative. And I would say to the neurodivergent artists, how clever is this that you can do this? Because not only can you navigate linear worlds, you have this inherent talent for multidimensional thinking that is flowed to make meaningful links. This is of great value. They'd often come from an outsider paradigm that didn't value this. But I was saying to them, this is of great value. This was really something they hadn't heard before because it had been so inherent. So that is the reason why this research is rooted in sociocultural value paradigm, because this is about tomorrow's world. This is about the sociocultural context of this and how valued this is in terms of our intellectual capital and our economic contribution to this world and our society. And then there was COVID. And COVID, in the main, was terrible for many people, really awful, but often allowed neurodivergent thinking to flourish because technology is the way we communicate. And we were able to network. And you will find many neurodivergent people during COVID were networking like busy bees. They were really at it. So, quotes from neurodivergent interviewees, you just do it. It's almost counter to intellectual analytical approach. It's something innate. I don't know, it just feels good. It feels right. Everything is very fast with incredible rushes. I've had to physically slow down as my thinking can get faster. It's like a spiral. I get spun round and round. So that was my research. I graduated in 2018. But since then, I have been working incredibly hard with Achievability board members and our now emergent editorial board on the Achievability e-journal, because we recognised how important it is to get the neurodivergent voice published. Our e-journal is about academic rigour, but we will accept different formats rather than just text. And we set out to support all authors in their publication. We've had an e-journal already. It happened in 2020. Neurodiverse Voices, Good Practice in the Workplace. We had a virtual launch. And we are now hosted by the Central School of Speech and Drama, which we are delighted about because the CSSD have a really good research portfolio and they have an excellent team of people, staff, who support neurodivergent students. So this is our PDF here where you can find our e-journal. These are our aims: to exchange and debate about neurodiversity, to support and promote new researchers and practitioners, and to foster interdisciplinary work, and to find new audiences in journal fields. Our editorial policy is this: we are user-led, we are inclusive in approach, all submissions are peer-reviewed, we give feedback that is clear and supportive, but we maintain editorial standards that are similar to more formal academic journals. Our future: we're just about to do another e-journal. That's the title, Neurodivergent Voices, Good Practice in the Workplace in a Time of COVID. It's a result of a Zoom seminar we hosted in 2020 We hope that most of our journals will be a result of the seminars. Our journal is funded by Achievability, and we hope that our e-journals will deal with current debates that are topical for neurodivergent people. Publications are a result of these debates and conferences and seminars, and guest editors are to be invited. And I've had that conversation with Atif Chowdhury already, who is your other speaker. These are our references for this presentation, and here are some references that might be helpful for the future. I'll very quickly stop the share, and I'd like to just see if I can go to our e-journal, which I might not be able to do. Let's have a look. Yes, I can. There we are. I hope I am sharing this with you. Let me just see if I can share this again. Technology. Here we are. I'm sharing the e-journal with you, I hope. And you can see this is our first e-journal, and it's interactive. It allows you to go to and forth, across, up or down. We're very proud of it. It's very clear in format, and you can print it out if you so wish. So that's my presentation to you. It's been a delight, and I hope this is recorded well for you to understand what I've been saying. Thanks so much for inviting me to your conference.